Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strip Search, the comic strip podcast. We are back again. We did not make you wait months this time. We are back a mere month after our last show. I'm Pete Chianca, and I'm here as always with Dave London. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Pete.
How are things going on your end?
Things are going well. Can't complain, other than COVID and, the world at large and war in Europe. I can't
World
complain.
War III, and yeah,
Yeah.
other than that, things are going great. Well, we will hopefully give people a little bit of a distraction from world events with our talk of comics, comic strips, comic books, illustration, and all sorts of other fun stuff. Speaking of which, of course, Dave and I grew up in the 80s. That's when we met at school, and
We should specify 1980s. Just
that's true. Yes,
so,
we did not we're not that old. Although some folks I work with might think I am. And I know my original favorite strips was Bloom County by
absolutely.
Kirk Brethid, and it was really like nothing else at the time. It sort of took the Doonesbury style, but went on a really just off-kilter path from there. And it sort of branched off into a couple of other strips that he did, one called Outland, and he did a strip called Opus about Opus the Penguin, the most famous character. Anyway, he came back a few years ago with a Facebook version of Bloom County, and it must have really piqued his interest in getting more exposure, because now it's going to be a TV show. You've heard about this?
I have heard. I have mixed feelings about this because I kind of like Bloom County in the original form, like you're talking about back in the 80s, and I've got all the book compilations, one of my absolute favorites. I'm not sure how it will be translating to the live action or animation on TV.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I'm not sure I want to know what they're supposed to sound like.
Yeah.
There
I mean, with Peanuts, obviously there's so many Peanut specials, and we know the voices of the people who do Peanuts just because it's been around for so long. But you kind of have this image in your mind of what the characters sound like, and to hear that, however they cast it could sort of just take away from that what we have already created in our own world.
And I know that's one of the reasons Bill Watterson never let anybody do that with Calvin and Hobbes. Of course, he never let anybody do anything with Calvin and Hobbes, and he's perfectly happy to live like a hermit somewhere and not allow any marketing or commercialization. And good for him, because of course it's opened the door wide for bootleggers to sell fake Calvin merchandise, and not all of it is especially flattering. But but we will see, and we'll let you know when we. I think that's going to be on Fox, and I don't think they've announced a premiere date yet, but we will keep people posted, because as children of the 80s, because the 80s are back, Dave. I don't know if you realize that.
I do realize. We were talking about this. The Russians are the bad guys.
Right.
Michael Keaton's playing Batman.
Yeah.
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is the new TV show. I guess that's the 90s.
Yeah, but it counts, I think.
Law and Order is back.
Law and Order is back. That's also the 90s, I think. We've completely lost track of
it blends.
Yes, if you're anything like me, you've completely lost track of all the decades. But we will keep up with that for our readers. And we have a very exciting guest today, who we will get to in a second. But I need to plug something first. It's not even one of our things.
What is it?
It is a new book by our good friend Pat Sandy, who you might know from the comic strip Next Door Neighbors. He's been on our podcast several times. Great guy, hilarious. His strip is terrific. And finally, after many years, he has compiled the first bunch of them into a book that's available on Amazon. And from him personally, if you'd like him to draw a little doodle in it, visit our website, petpeevescomic.com, and you will see a link to purchase Pat's book. And we are trying to get him here to discuss it. Hopefully next month he will be among our featured guests. But in the meantime, if you'd like to do a little homework in advance of that appearance, get the book and take a look. You won't be disappointed. I think that's all I had, Dave. We're very excited about getting to our guest of the day, whose name is David Sipress, which probably sounds familiar to people because he is a New Yorker cartoonist extraordinaire. Literally was their first daily cartoonist for their website, which sounds exhausting. It's hard enough doing them sporadically.
But you only draw it once. You don't have to draw it on everybody's internet. So.
Well, that's true. You don't have to go to everybody's house to draw it. I guess that makes it a little easier. And he too wrote a book, and he's going to be here to talk to us about that. So stay tuned. We will be back in less than 30 seconds with David Sipress. Thanks, everybody. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Strip Search, the comic strip podcast with me, Pete Chianca, and my partner, Dave London. And we are thrilled now to interview our special guest for this month's episode. David Sipress's cartoons have been appearing in the New Yorker since 1998. Prior to that, he was a regular contributor to the Boston Phoenix for many years, and we could be here all day listing all the other publications where his cartoons have appeared. He was the writer and host of Conversations with Cartoonists. That was a series of onstage interviews with many of the artists who contribute to the New Yorker. And he was also NewYorker.com's first daily cartoonist, which sounds frankly exhausting, but we could talk more about that. His memoir is called What's So Funny? It's out this month, and it was just excerpted in the New Yorker last week. So welcome, David Sipress, to Strip Search.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I just have to say, I'm about 2/3 of the way through What's So Funny. So don't spoil the ending for me. I still have to find out whether or not you become a cartoonist. But it really, it's beautifully written. I mean, it really is a wonderful, it's a cartoonist origin story, but it's so much more than that. So I've just really been dying to ask you sort of why a memoir, why now, and, how'd you approach it?
Well, the germination of the idea came for a number of years. I'd done slide talks about my work and about cartoons and the New Yorker cartoons. And I always began them with a series of slides of cartoons that went along with my telling my sort of autobiography in very brief form. And that was the germination of an idea. I started thinking, is there a way I could combine autobiography with cartoons? Not a book of cartoons, not entirely a book of text, but something that brought the two together. And then I started writing these personal history essays for NewYorker.com. And that's when I discovered that I could write. I could write more than a caption, which it took me a while to figure out that was true. Writing captions is this wonderful, making cartoons is this wonderful, fast-paced, instantaneous creative process. And when I first thought about writing a book and writing a memoir, I just felt exhausted before I even started. Somehow I forced myself to start, and as time went on, I got more and more comfortable with it. And I began to see that the cartoons, along with the text, were kind of a key to intensifying certain anecdotes that I tell, I wanted the book to have an overall tone of humor as much as possible. And so the cartoons were helpful in leavening the more disturbing and devastating aspects of anybody's story with their family. And so I began to realize that the two work together really well. And I also began to realize that in my long life, there's basically been absolutely nothing I've experienced that I haven't made a cartoon about at some point. So, that also helped.
Yeah, it really does do an excellent job of weaving those together. And it's for people who are interested in the process, that is part of the fun of it, I think, hearing or reading about, part of your life story, and then seeing how you manage to put a funny twist on it. And it is not all funny. I mean, like you said, a lot of it is almost hard to read, because you're seeing these very sort of intimate family dynamics that can be difficult, but it's so relatable, because like you said, everybody's life has these things, and it's relatable on a bunch of different levels. It's like it's an immigrant story in terms of talking about your parents. It's a family dynamic story, and it's funny and sad and difficult and all these things at the same time. So was that sort of your mindset going into it, trying to balance all those things?
I honestly, I never sit down to make a cartoon or write a book or anything with a preconceived notion in my mind that I want it to be whatever. I just started writing. It took me forever to begin. I did a cartoon back then for myself of a guy sitting at a computer, staring at the monitor, hands ready to type. And the title on the monitor says, "Nothing remotely interesting has ever happened to me, a memoir." And that's kind of, where I was stuck at the beginning. But I started writing, and it became a real adventure, and everything the book turned out to be was not what I expected, particularly when I started out. But the family stories kept coming back and coming back. And pretty soon I was addicted and couldn't stop writing.
Mm-hmm. Just from a personal perspective, I found, you tell the story of, your father, who was a jeweler in New York City, and, had been an immigrant, coming from Russia. It reminded me of the story of my grandparents. My grandmother actually came over from Russia during the revolution. My grandfather was born here, but he opened a men's clothing store in New York City. And dropped out of school at a young age for prior to that to help his family. So a lot of these things, rang a bell with me. And that, I guess, you'd have to say is the centerpiece of the book, your relationship with your parents and your father in particular, and their, thoughts and impressions about your various career choices, among other things.
Yeah, and a lot of it is also about the secrecy around that. My father in particular, who was not an easy person to get information out of about that distant past, which I, of course, spent my life being curious about, but it was only towards the very end of his life that I got any real answers. The relationship with my mother, my father, and my sister, other than my wife, are the most important relationships I've ever had. And yet it took writing the book for me to understand a lot about them that I hadn't understood before, and to reach a kind of resolution about each of them that is really, in the end, kind of rewarding to get there.
Mm-hmm. There was probably the sort of key chapter in the book was just excerpted in the New Yorker last week, talking about when you sort of broke it to your parents and your father in particular about how you had dropped out of graduate school to pursue cartooning, to be a cartoonist. Can you just talk a little bit about that section of the book and what it was like to write it?
Yeah, after I graduated from college, I went to Harvard to study in a graduate program in Soviet studies, believe it or not. And it was a real struggle, and ended sort of badly. And I walked out during finals of a second semester, never looked back. But it took me a while to tell my father. And that was what really terrified me, because the fact that I was there at Harvard was so important to him, and was all wrapped up in his own sense of his own success. And I was terrified. And the excerpt that you're talking about, the chapter you're talking about, recounts the phone call I made when, about a month after I dropped out, having lied to them, to my parents, about, classes are going great, and I'm really learning a lot. And meanwhile, I was wandering the streets of Cambridge, trying to work up the courage to make the call. And that excerpt recounts the conversation with my father, the dialogue with my father and my mother. And it ends rather badly. I don't know how much I should talk about it, but my father cursed me, basically. And it was funny, but I still to this day can't explain the reaction that I had. And yet somehow at the time it made sense, and a little part of it makes sense to me now. I basically, uh, I was calling from a phone booth near Harvard Yard, and I went up to the top of Quincy Street, and I looked down. Uh, I got on my bicycle, and I pedaled as fast as I could. And when I reached the curb, I closed my eyes, took my feet off the pedals, and glided through the oncoming traffic funneling into Harvard Square. Uh, and brakes screeched, and people screamed, and I landed. I hit the curb on the other side, and I landed, and I sat on the sidewalk and opened my eyes. And like I say in the book, the thought that went through my 22-year-old head, and we all know at 22 you have some thoughts that don't really make sense, but the thought I had was, okay, I guess I'm supposed to go on living. And the next thing I did was I got myself up and I went down the street to Bartley Burgers, which the fact checkers at the New Yorker tried to insist I call Mr. Bartley's Burger Cottage.
Oh,
But,
no.
But I said, no, it's Bartley Burgers. Forget about it, fact checkers. And I sat down and I had a little lined notebook with me. And the first thing I did was I wrote down every single word of that conversation because I knew someday I would want to revisit it. And then I drew a cartoon, and the cartoon was my father and me, and my father saying to me, um, "Why do you need to find out who you are when I can just tell you?" And that was the moment I became a cartoonist, and left everything else behind. There was a lot of struggles after that, but that was where until I told my father, I couldn't call myself a cartoonist. Once I told my father, I felt like I'd stepped across the threshold. So.
Yeah, it's an amazing moment in the book, and I guess it couldn't have been very long after that you sought out the people at Boston After Dark, which would soon after that morph into the Boston Phoenix. And there's actually, maybe you could talk a little bit about your first visit there. You mentioned that in the book, and Dave and I, first of all, have spent a lot of time at that intersection, Harvard Square, so we're doubly horrified here, picturing that in our heads.
It's scary, yeah.
But, and the burger joint, we've been there as well.
Yes, that's one of our favorites. But you're
Burger
right.
Cottage.
No one calls it the Burger Cottage. So yeah, talk a little bit just about how what happened when you walked in the door there.
Well, I had been drawing a lot of cartoons, and I was making copies of them. And like I say in the book, I started a totally useless business of going to Harvard Square and trying to sell my Xerox copies of my cartoons for 10 cents a piece. And at some point, do you know who Charlie Giuliano is? He was a music writer and a sort of Denzian of everything hippie back then in Cambridge. And I had a conversation with him, and he was working at Broadside, which was another alternative paper. And my first cartoon was published in Broadside. And then I started hearing about this Boston After Dark, and I knew about it. And one day I just got up my courage and I took my bag of Xerox copies and I went to the office. And to my surprise, the receptionist said, "Oh yeah, go right in. The editor's right in there." And I went in and immediately smelled, it was redolent with the odor of marijuana. And to my amazement, they said, "Sure, you're in next week." And so that was the beginning of my 30-odd year career of being in the what then turned into the Phoenix every single week. And I look back on that work, and it's pretty primitive in places and somewhat different than what I do now. But I'm really proud that I was in there for that long, and I added a touch of humor to that page every week.
It was yeah, it was a real Boston institution, and a shame when it went away a few years ago, like so many other papers, sadly.
So many incredible writers work for
Yeah.
that paper. It's really impressive when you go down the list.
They recently made it available digitally, the whole run of the paper.
I've been looking at it.
It's
Yeah,
fun, isn't it?
it really is. It's really, you can just step back in time and remember all those years that are, for me at least, a little foggy at this point. I was reminded of so much going through that archive. It's really incredible. Yeah.
Now, did you ever feel like an outsider, being a native New Yorker in enemy territory all those years?
Most definitely. I lived in Boston, in Cambridge and Boston for 15 years. And I made a lot of really great friends, did some interesting stuff, not only cartoons, but I was part of something called the Graphic Workshop. I don't know if you were aware of that. It was a silkscreen workshop. We did posters for all the student demonstrations and then later for theaters and stuff like that. And I had a really interesting life in Boston, but I always felt like I belonged back in New York. I just couldn't get the courage to do it, in large part because my parents were in New York and I just didn't know how I was going to survive being in the same city as my parents at that point. And so my time in Boston was kind of tainted with this feeling of being an outsider and being much more connected to that city 500 miles to the south. Um, and But it didn't prevent me from, rooting for the Bruins and rooting for the Celtics and just loving lots of things about the city. It's a beautiful city, and it's so much more peaceful than this place up here, down here. So
I noticed the Red Sox were not mentioned in that list.
well, you probably know my famous, maybe you don't know my famous Red Sox story, but when I was first in the New Yorker 2 or 3 years on, I did a cartoon. It was a guy, and this is when the Red Sox were pretty pathetic. And it's a guy lying on the psychiatrist's couch, and he's got a Red Sox t-shirt on. And the shrink is saying to him, rooting for them is a disease, Ben. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And that and a couple of other ones I did about the Red Sox right around that time precipitated a phone call. From one day, I picked up the phone, and this woman said, "I'm the personal assistant to Larry Lucchino, CEO and president of the Red Sox." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And she said, "He loves your cartoons about the Red Sox, and he wants to invite you and your wife to Fenway Park to sit in his booth and see a game anytime you want this summer. Please just come. We'd love to meet you." And like an idiot, I said, "Oh man, that's so ironic. I'm an avid Yankees fan." And there was a long silence, and she said, "We'll have to get back to you." And she hung up the phone. And that's the last I ever heard of it. So that was my experience with the Red Sox.
Oh, that's great.
So this is actually a good transition to bring up the New Yorker. And so you're obviously one of the most well-respected, most famous New Yorker cartoonists. Can you talk to us about how you made the transition to become a regular at the New Yorker?
Well, what you're calling a transition was a 25-year struggle, really. I started submitting to them not long after I started at the Phoenix, and only sold my first one in 1997, October 11th, I believe, 1997. And it had been my lifelong dream. I mean, when I was a kid, as I say in the book, I used to draw cartoons, cut them out, and paste them into my mother's New Yorkers over the cartoons that were in there, because that was my lifelong fantasy. And it just took forever and a change of editorship for me to sell my first one. And once I did, it just felt like the best thing that had ever happened to me. When your childhood dream comes true, it's pretty much the best thing that's ever happened to you. And that was very different. I learned so much just by seeing my work in that magazine. I learned what I wanted to change and improve about my drawing, what I wanted to change and improve about my ideas. And the first 2 or 3 years there was a real learning process for me about how to make a really good, really funny cartoon. And things have been going there pretty well ever since. I have to pinch myself sometimes because I can't believe it happened that way. You know, it's just so great to be associated with that magazine.
So the various New Yorker cartoonists obviously have a range of styles, and there's a lot of literature out there about what makes something a New Yorker cartoon versus a cartoon for another magazine or periodical. In your view, what makes something a New Yorker cartoon, and specifically what makes your work a New Yorker cartoon?
Well, I think that was much more easy to define in the earlier years of the magazine. I think we can all say, you know, they were generally about sophisticated New Yorkers, and everybody standing around drinking martinis and being witty. And then you might be able to say what a New Yorker cartoon is. But by the time I came on, Bob Mankoff, who had taken over as cartoon editor, was trying to diversify the kinds of drawing and the kinds of writing that were being published. I can just say that now it's impossible to define a New Yorker cartoon, because right now the way that cartoons are in the magazine is so varied that I can't even, there's no way I could tell you what a New Yorker cartoon is. But I feel like, especially for me, I never was considered a New Yorker cartoonist, in large part because of my drawing, I think. I think my ideas had a certain amount of sophistication, but I purposely love to draw the way I draw, which is, I like the reader to imagine that I got the idea and I drew it. And it's very direct and spontaneous. And I've always loved drawing that way. And so when I appeared in the magazine, I became part of what diversified the magazine in terms of images and then also ideas. So my answer is, I don't think there's such a thing anymore as a New Yorker cartoon. There's a David Sipress New Yorker cartoon. There's a Ed Steed New Yorker cartoon. There's a, you know, Michael Maslin New Yorker cartoon, and Emily Flake New Yorker cartoon, Liana Fink New Yorker cartoon. I mean, there are just a million different kinds of approaches to drawing and ideas these days, which I think is a great thing, actually.
You mentioned a little bit about your style. Something I like to ask all our guests, being the artist of the Pete Dave duo, I'm the techie. I like to get into the question about the cartoonist process and tools. So I want to jump into that, and if you can talk about the process you use to physically draw, and if you're using old school pen and ink, if you've thought about using some of the newer electronic techniques or
kidding? No way, impossible. Oh, no, I've been drawing with the same Crow Quill pen since I started at the Boston Phoenix. That's all I do is the Crow Quill dipping pen. And what I love about it is that it's so hard to control, because I love what I call in the book and what our students call the happy accidents. I love the mistakes that happen because the tool is difficult to control. So it really fits my needs to have everything, as I said before, seem direct and spontaneous. I love drawing with it. I love, and if I ever make too big a mess, there's always whiteout, or these days Photoshop. So that's it. I mean, I do my rough sketches using just a regular pen and I send those in my batch every week. And then when it's time to do a finish, I take out the Crow Quill and get my Bristol pad out, smooth if you want to know. And I do my final drawing. And sometimes the rough and the final drawing are very hard to tell apart. And I can tell you one funny story. I think it's pretty funny about my drawing that I've told several times. I hope you haven't heard it before, but when I first started at the magazine and I went, there used to be I mean, back in the day, the parties were incredible. Especially Tina Brown started it, and then it continued. And 3 or 4 times a year, there'd be these unbelievable gatherings, these sort of intellectual celebrity marathons. And I was at one of my first ones, and I was just standing there. I said, I can't believe it, David. I can't believe you're here. I was standing there holding my drink, and there was a group of older cartoonists over by the bar, including several of my heroes. And I saw one of them extricate himself from the group and come wandering across the floor, and his drink sloshing this way and sloshing that. He came right up to me and he said, I know who you are. I said, wow, he knows who I am. That's incredible. And he said, you don't belong in that magazine. What do you draw with, a stick? And then he turned around and walked away. And I'm standing there like this. And I started saying to him, no, wait, that's the way I draw. That's my style. I draw that way on purpose. Just because I don't draw like you doesn't mean it's good drawing. It isn't good drawing. And it was a somewhat devastating moment for me. A friend of mine who was next to me put his arm around me and said, you're pissing people off. That means you're really getting someplace. But what I did was I went home, and I didn't even go to my home. I went to my studio that night around midnight, and I sat down and drew a cartoon that later appeared as the lead cartoon in the cartoon issue of the magazine that year. And it's a cartoon of a well-drawn, for me, guy and a very badly drawn dog. And the guy saying to the dog, bad drawing. And that's how I dealt with that. And, that's a thing about being, as you both know, being a creative person, and for me doing cartoons, is that when those difficult things happen in life, the things that get you angry or scare you, there's always this place you can go to be creative and to feel the optimism that brings, that doesn't necessarily cure you of the bad feelings, but it just kind of gives you a way to navigate the situation that most people don't have. And I feel enormously lucky that I have that creative bone in my body. Yeah.
Are you basically in cartoon search mode 24 hours a day? Everything that happens is setting off that little bell in your head that, oh, I might have something here?
I pretty much am, and including, as I say in the book, in situations where it's not entirely appropriate. I thought up many cartoons lying in Shavasana and yoga class, exactly when I'm supposed to be not thinking about that sort of a thing. I call it my cartoon brain. That's the way I think about it. And it's always, there's some little part of me that's always hoping to hear or see something that I can turn into a cartoon. Now, lately with this book thing, it's just kind of pushed that to the side a little, but I'm starting to get back to it. My favorite example of inappropriate cartoon brain activity was in an argument I was having with my wife several years ago. And it was a pretty fierce argument. And she was saying some of the stuff she always says when we have an argument. And at one point she looked at me and she said, I can tell by your eyes, David, are you thinking of a cartoon right now? I said, no, absolutely not. No way. And then about a month later, she opened the New Yorker and saw this cartoon, which is a man and a woman having an argument. And the man is saying, well, if it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? So I was revealed as having my cartoon brain on at that totally inappropriate moment.
Yeah. No, you can't turn it off.
No, can't turn it off. So watch out, guys. I'm working on a bald cartoon right now. I'm find one to talk.
Yeah. So you've talked about a couple of cartoons that you've come up with over the years. I have a question for you. It's a two-parter question. Okay. Question one is, out of all the cartoons that you've done of your own, what is your favorite? Whether it's New Yorker or otherwise, what's your favorite gag you've written? And part B is, what gag cartoon that somebody else did did you look at and said, God, I wish I wrote / drew that one?
Wow. Well, the first part is a lot easier for me to answer. The that bad drawing cartoon I described is one of my favorites. Another is this cartoon that's been the most published, republished, reprinted, stolen of all my cartoons. And it wasn't even a New Yorker cartoon. And it's two people walking down the street, and the woman is saying to the man, "My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane." And that cartoon was incredibly meaningful to me because it exactly, for the first time, was exactly articulating the difficulty I have being alive at this time, and when all this shit is going on. And
Was that time frame around 2016? I'm guessing.
actually, that was from the late 90s. I think I was reacting to what was going on in Bosnia at that time. But every time things in the world go to hell, that cartoon starts appearing everywhere on the internet. And what I like about it is that it's not actually a joke. It's a sometimes you just put what you're feeling into a cartoon, and you're amazed to find out that everyone else is feeling the same thing. And that recognition somehow creates humor. It's a kind of a mystery to me. So that is definitely a favorite. Another favorite of mine is one that's in the book, that is very much about that moment I described before when I dropped out of graduate school and spoke to my father. And that's why that cartoon is so meaningful to me. It's a primitive scene, some ancient landscape, and there's a mother and a father, and the father is holding an axe, and they're surrounded by carcasses of dead animals and skeletons of dead animals. And there's a kid with a stick and a bag on the end of the stick ready to go. And the father says to the kid, "You're leaving, you're quitting school after everything we sacrificed for you?" And that I love that cartoon as well. I'm trying to think of the answer to the second part, and I would basically say that anything by Sam Gross probably fits that. But I love his cartoon of the two snails looking at the tape dispenser saying, "I know it's a tape dispenser, but I love her anyway," or whatever that caption is.
Right.
To me, that's brilliant. Or his one of the penguin flying. I can't remember the caption of that. Any Sam Gross cartoon is a favorite. I just think he's the funniest cartoonist that's ever lived. So,
any other cartoonists, either panel or strip, that stand out in your mind as inspirations, or just people you really whose work you really enjoy?
I'm a little loath to name people, but I will say that as a young person, I was obsessed with Steinberg, as many cartoonists have been, because he showed me what a magical thing a line could be and how much you could do with a line. And he wasn't really a cartoonist. He hated being called a cartoonist. But I was drawn to his drawing. It fascinated me and made me want to draw. And so he was really, really important to me. And over the years, I love, for instance, Charles Addams, wonderful. I love how intensely interesting and complicated his work is as far as the art of it. But like I said before, I really like the simple, direct kind of drawing the best. And the artists over the years who draw that way are the ones that I have been most influenced by and really love.
That's great. Well, everybody, we've been talking to David Sipress, the New Yorker cartoonist and the author of What's So Funny, his new memoir, which is out this month. Where can people get the book? Everywhere where quality books are sold, I'm assuming?
Everywhere where extremely high quality books are sold. yeah, and I always encourage people to go to their independent bookstore if possible. But yeah, you can get it anywhere, and I encourage you to get it.
Do you plan to do any signings or talks about the book?
We're working on it. There's going to be a sort of launch party thing here on April 3rd at the Housing Works bookstore in Lower Manhattan. And I've been doing a lot of interviews, which has been really fun and really interesting. And I have more coming up. And so we'll have to see what other events will happen, but you go to my website, davidsipress.com, and find out all about them.
Well, if you make it back up to Boston or Cambridge, to your old stomping grounds, let us know. We'd be thrilled to meet you in person and get a signature.
I sure will. You know, it's really great. I've done a lot of interviews, and the ones I like the best are doing it with people who do what I do, because that there's a connection there where I don't have to say all kinds of stuff I have to say to other people, that we understand each other. And that makes it really fun for me to do an interview.
That's great to hear. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in once again to Strip Search, the comic strip podcast. Dave London and I would like to say once again, thank you to David Sipress, and stay tuned next month for yet another episode. We'll talk to you soon, everybody. Take care.